Night driving made the road feel like a long, steady heartbeat. 2 thumps of tires over a seam in the asphalt. A pause. Another 2, and then the dark, swallowing sound again. Somewhere east of Avranches, the convoy rolled with headlights hooded to slits, and engines talking in low, patient tones when the prisoner finally spoke. He had been captured at a crossroads that afternoon, a Wehrmacht staff colonel who still carried himself like a parade. "You will outrun your gasoline," he had told us earlier, with the small, indulgent smile of a man reciting a theorem. The American way. He meant the speed, the appetite, the way Third Army lunged like a hungry animal. But near midnight, as 40 trucks hummed by in formation, and a military policeman waved us through a village without letting us slow even for breath, the colonel tilted his head and listened as if the night itself had turned into a radio. The sound was not battle. It was a schedule. It was a rule-given motion. "What is this?" he asked, not to be taught, but because his old math had just failed. "It's called red ball," the sergeant driver said, eyes forward, hands steady at 10 and 2. "Sir, you might want to get some sleep. It runs 24 hours. We used to laugh at our own appetite, too, back when Cherbourg's cranes still creaked like old knees, and our maps had more questions than roads. We joked in the motor pool that Patton's tanks drank like college boys on payday, and that no nation could afford to keep a mechanized army fed at that pace. The Germans agreed, at briefings, in diaries, sometimes over the white linen of a staff lunch. They knew a dash needs a pantry. They knew our pantry sat across an ocean. They knew ports don't uncrowd themselves by wishing. And yet, on August 25th, 1944, while some units were still pulling the last barbs out of Normandy's hedgerows, the Transportation Corps lit a green lamp and told truck companies to follow it like a star. Dedicated one-way highways were declared. No civilians, no oncoming, no excuses. The route started simple. Cherbourg to Chartres, straight as necessity, and every intersection policed like a pulse point. You didn't stop. You didn't meander. You rolled. By midnight, the painted circles with a red dot inside, the ball, were nailed to signposts, daubed on barns, chalked on walls, and the road discovered its own gravity. The plan did not look romantic when written. It looked like a ledger with shoulders. Take every truck we can spare, GMCs, Dodges, anything with a bed and a beat-up soul, and load fuel, ammo, rations. Put the best drivers behind the wheel and the hungry ones behind them. Build a law, maintain interval, hold speed, no dead stops unless the entire column halts, no lights except the slits, no smoking, no showing off. Give the MPs authority to own every crossroads between ocean and army. Let them hold traffic like a clenched fist, and then release it in one smooth gesture when a convoy's nose arrives. The first days were a mess of promise and grit. Engines coughed out of habit, tires sought nails as if magnetized, and the maps were wrong in all the familiar ways. Roads marked good were mud, roads marked mud were suddenly paved, bridges marked intact had been politely blown to pieces 24 hours earlier. But the crews learned their paragraphs fast. Within a week, a driver who had never seen France could drive 100 miles of it without ever reading a sign. He followed tail lights, baton arcs, and a rhythm that did not belong to a single man. Here is where the numbers begin to sound like fiction. At its peak, Red Ball put 558 trucks on the road for the express alone, and that didn't count the thousands more that fed the feeders. Every day, the line moved roughly 12,000 to 12,500 tons forward, gasoline in cans and drums, 30 and 50 ammunition boxed so tight you could stack a platoon on it, rations in olive drab that rattled like somebody else's childhood kitchen. For 82 days, August 25th to November 16th, the road poured. Contemporary records turn calm when they describe magnitude because calm is the only tone that will hold that much mass. More than 412,000 tons went forward in that span, and if you prefer mileage to tonnage, call it on the order of 121 to 122 million ton-miles. At any daylight hour, you could count perhaps 900 vehicles somewhere on the route just then, and at night, the count didn't so much fall as change color. The road did not sleep. It only breathed shallower at 2 a.m. and louder at 4. Most of the men who made the road breathe were Black Americans. About 3 out of 4 drivers on Red Ball wore a uniform that promised equality later and a patch that demanded performance now. Segregated truck companies climbed into cabs with dignity and climbed out covered in dust to load, unload, or repair. Then climbed back in. They learned to thread a 2.5-tonner through blackout curves by the taste of a turn and the memory of a pothole. They learned to read the baton grammar of MPs who were sometimes only silhouettes against a lantern and a glove. They learned the kind of fatigue that sleeps with its boots on and wakes at the sound of a wrench falling 2 bays over. They kept their own counsel when a mess tent went quiet at their arrival, and they kept the column rolling when a colonel who had mocked American supply lines the week before asked, with earnest good manners, how the gas could possibly arrive again today when it had arrived yesterday and the day before. It arrives, the drivers said without saying, because we bring it. We pretended the road was smooth because pretending made it safer. In truth, the express was a long improvisation played in a strict key. Governors came off engines when a schedule demanded a few extra miles per hour, and a sergeant trusted a driver not to be a fool. Wreckers prowled the route like shepherd dogs, sniffing out the lame and dragging them to the shoulder so the flock could pass. Pit stop repairs, fuel pump here, fan belt there, a quick patch on a tube, a jerry can dribble into a thirsty carb, kept dozens of small problems from becoming one large failure that would ripple backward for miles. When a truck did die in a bad spot, the drill was old as any road. Chain up, pull it out of the lane, get the column moving, fix the corpse later. Mechanics learned to swap a tire in 12 yawns and a curse, to coax an engine through a sulk with a screwdriver's whisper, to listen to bearings and know the difference between a complaint and a prophecy. Each repair bought minutes, minutes bought miles, miles bought meals for men you'd never meet, and shells for guns you'd never fire, but were glad to imagine. Route notes changed weekly, then daily. What began as Cherbourg-Chartres stretched eastward as Patton's armored spearheads wrote new paragraphs on the map. Drop points pushed toward Soissons and Sommesus, then beyond, until a round trip no longer sounded like a drive and more like a tour of duty. A driver could put 300, 400, 500 miles under his tires in a blur of towns, some rebuilt enough for a bakery to be open at dawn, some still so broken that windows wore curtains of smoke. The MPs learned the names of their intersections like a doctor knows familiar veins. The right-hand fork by the church with the missing bell. the S-curve where rain made grease out of clay, the humpback bridge that kicked the rear axle to remind you who owned the sky. They did not blow whistles when a red ball column approached. They raised a baton, and the world understood that rank yielded to cargo. Generals slowed and smiled with a sort of hard politeness when an MP's palm told them no. They saluted the tonnage and the time. Enemy harassment became another kind of weather. Stray 88s tried to read the pattern and scrawl a correction into it. A few did, and wreckers wrote their own counters in the margins by hauling twisted axles into ditches and sweeping small shrapnel with big brooms. Night fighters had more hope than proof. Strafing light columns in the blue hour gave them a little revenge that cost us little momentum. The truth is cruel and simple. A single train is a better target than 50 trucks on 100 miles of road. Try to hit us, and the net tears around the hole, but does not fail. German generals understood railroads because railroads make a clean expression on a staff map. They did not understand the stubborn arithmetic of 1,000 separate engines. They mocked American supply lines as if our appetite were a vice. Red Ball turned appetite into a weapon. If logistics had a sound in late summer 1944, it was not clanking, it was humming. The happy, maddening hum of a convoy that refused to be late. There were rules inside the cab that never made it into pamphlets. Keep a photo on the dash, but tape it down. If it flies up at a bad moment, you'll reach for it, and that reach will cost you a life. Keep a rag handy for the windshields inside. Your breath will fog it when your stomach knots near dawn. When the man in front of you drifts on a straight, tap your horn twice, short and soft. If he taps back, he's awake. If he doesn't, you hit the high beam slit, and he'll blink and remember where he is. Trade seats at the dump point if your buddy's eyes look like coins. Fold the map. Memorize the turns. Trust the baton. Call the MPs, "Sir," even when you outrank them. On this road, their stripes are taller than yours. If you're black, and the mess won't serve you hot, eat what's warm and be warmer to your engine, because the engine will pay you back with steady labor, and the mess tent won't. Keep one extra jerry can under the tarp that no one knows about but you. Some mornings, that quiet insurance turns the clock from red to green. One afternoon, near Chartres, a German prisoner, rumor said he had a general's tabs under the mud on his sleeves, stood at a safe distance behind a rope while a column rattled past. He had the trained expression officer's practice, the one that says, "I will not be impressed until after dinner." But the road had skipped dinner for weeks. A wrecker slid by towing an exhausted GMC. Behind it, another truck carried nothing but tires. Behind that, a truck that had been shot through the radiator now carried water cans and a patched smile. The prisoner watched a First Army Jeep wedge into a lay-by and wait, engine idling, while a black private in a dust-crusted tanker eased the big vehicle around a corner without clipping a wall. The prisoner said something quiet to the guard, and the guard said something back that wasn't translated. The private did not look over. He had a column behind him and a clock in front, and a war that would not wait for two men to find their manners. He rolled on. Patton's staff learned to ask the Express a better question than, "Can you?" They learned to ask, "By when?" The difference sounds small until you stake an offensive on it. Tanks do not cross rivers on rhetoric. Artillery does not fire because you believe in it. Infantry eats or it does not. The day Third Army paused near the Moselle, its breath caught not for lack of courage but for lack of molecules, fuel molecules, food molecules, powder grains. Then the road's hum rose a note. The MPs drew a harder line at intersections, and the baton fell less often so that the columns could ride their green wave further. Stores officers pulled reserve pallets a day early because along this road, reserve meant about to be used. And nobody wanted to learn the difference by getting to the bottom of a stack too late. Generals who had once mocked Americans for trying to sprint a marathon found themselves looking north and south along highways that refused to be empty and concluded, with the professionals' unromantic awe, that they had mismeasured the American mood. Fatigue is the enemy that never wears a uniform. It creeps into the joints and rewires the jokes so that the same punchline lands too hard, and then not at all. Drivers paired with drivers who could swap the wheel and the world without losing speed. Companies paired with mechanics who could make a carburetor apologize for its sins. Chaplains prayed over steering wheels. Medics taped wrists that had learned to ache in a new century. Once, when rain turned the road into the kind of slick that makes even a confident man cautious, a column slowed and then slowed again, and a corporal in an MP helmet stood in the middle of the crossroads with rain drilling his collar and shouted one word, "Go!" It was not a command so much as a spell. The trucks obeyed because obedience felt like the safest idea in the rain. Somewhere far east, a tanker rolled into a farmyard where infantry had been calculating whether their last jerry cans could stretch into tomorrow. The tanker's driver climbed down like a man too tired to be proud. The captain put a hand on his shoulder, and the driver nodded once, a small bow that said, "The road does not love me, and I do not love it back. But we have a deal. Not everything worked. Some depots stacked the wrong ration on the wrong pallet, and a mess sergeant swore at boxes of peaches when he needed beans. A maintenance officer promised too many engines too soon, and then slept on a bench because the men in his bay refused to go home until the promise could be true. A bridge insisted on a weight limit that would have embarrassed the bold. We respected it and built a detour that felt like an insult to geometry. Red Ball did not win because it was a genius every day. It won because it failed fast and corrected faster, because it replaced a machine before the machine's feelings were hurt, because it kept score in hours and miles, and men fed rather than in speeches. You can call that unglamorous if you like. Or you can call it how the world gets saved on days when nobody has time for poetry. By November 16th, when the Express stood down from capital letters and returned to the lowercase labor all armies know, the ledger had stopped pretending to be small. 82 days, more than 412,000 tons, roughly 121 million ton miles, an average of 900 vehicles visible somewhere at any moment. And behind those 900, the rest of the rotating thousands, the spare, the broken, the repaired, the inbound, the outbound, the ones about to be born from crates, the ones about to die dignified in a salvage yard that smelled of hot metal and righteous laziness. The war did not end. The Ardennes would still ask for blood. But a joke had died quietly across the lines. The one about how Americans cannot possibly keep a dash supplied. The one about logistics as a weakness camouflaged as enthusiasm. German generals who had mocked our supply lines learned to read a sky that carried no thunderclouds and hear thunder anyway. It was not weather. It was trucks. Years later, You could find artifacts of that road in places museums do not reach. A gate hinge in rural France that had once been a spring leaf off a GMC. A wooden fence plank ripped from a crate that had carried 80 octane, now grayed into respectability. In a drawer, a driver's license with the corners gone soft, the photo stiff with the posture of a young man proving he belongs. In a mind, the knowledge of how a baton arcs when a human life depends on its grace. In a nation, the quiet pride that belongs to people who built a weapon without bullets and learned it worked. If you want the war's most overlooked system, it was not a tank or a plane. It was a convoy. It was an idea about time. It was a choice to pay the cost of abundance up front so that other men could spend freely in hours we would never see. The first week we learned how a convoy hears. Vision narrows at night, slit lamps, blackout curtains on the villages, alleys breathing coal smoke. But hearing expands until it is a sixth sense. You start to know a healthy gearbox from 50 yards by its faint, cheerful whine, and you know a U-joint bowing out because the truck hums in a way that is not a hum at all, but a warning disguised as music. The MP with the baton becomes percussion, counting you through the measure. Hold, 2 trucks, now go. The men in the cabs hum too, without meaning to, because the body likes to duet with steady rhythm. A driver will keep a harmonica in his breast pocket and never play it on the road even though he wants to. The engine is already playing the only tune that matters. Somewhere a colonel, standing in a doorway with a hand over his coffee to keep the dust out, hears the column pass and thinks of factories he has never seen and boys he will never meet. He thinks he is listening to trucks. He is listening to policy. If you chart the express on a map and keep the pen down for those 82 days, the line looks alive. It thickens near depots, thins near bridges, curls where roadwork insists on a detour, straightens where our engineers lay down a ribbon in a hurry. But the paper map lies about the third dimension, the dimension that matters most. The vertical axis is time. That is where the miracle lives. When the MPs clear a crossroad at Cherbourg precisely as a column's nose arrives, they are voting time into being. When a wrecker captain chooses to fix a water pump at mile marker 22 instead of dragging the truck to 27, he is sculpting time. When a driver takes a 5-minute nap sitting upright at a dump point because his buddy can steer by memory for the first leg back, he is making more time. The Germans could not defeat that axis. They could delay, or injure, or annoy. But they could not reverse time for more than a morning, and mornings are small things in a season like that one. Segregation traveled with us like a shameful relative. The men in the trucks felt it every time a line formed and eyes did that double count, where a man pretends not to notice your skin and notices only that. Yet the road needed what those men could do, and so the road told a different truth with a different mouth. It said, "You matter to the schedule." The schedule is sacred. Sacred is a hard word to use for gasoline and canned peaches, but the right one. A black sergeant guiding his driver through rain by tapping the dash with 2 fingers, slow for slow and fast for fast, was doing holy work. He knew it and did not require a sermon. He required tires, fuel, and a mess that stayed open 10 minutes after posted hours because the line had slipped somewhere west. When historians write of Red Ball, they sometimes say 75% of the drivers were African American and move on. It should be said slower than that. It should be said with the same care you use to set a jack under a differential that weighs more than your house. There is a particular smell to jerry cans when they have sat in a shadow half the day and then see sun. The metal grows a breath you can taste, and if you taste it too often, you stop noticing for a while until you do again. And then you worry about how much you have stopped noticing. Fuel is a polite liquid until it is not, and drivers learned the slow rituals that keep politeness intact. Wipe threads before you pour. Don't pour near a lantern. Don't curse the man who double-checks the cap. Do curse the man who leaves a can where it can slide. A full tank makes a truck heavy, steady, confident. An empty tank makes it honest, light on the nose, eager to lie about distance between here and the depot. Men became mathematicians of gallons, miles, and minutes. They learned to feel when a needle was lying and when it was telling a hard truth. They saved a pint so someone else could spend a gallon and never called it charity, because charity is optional and Red Ball wasn't. Improvisation was not anarchy. It wore a uniform of rules battered into usefulness. Removing a governor didn't mean joyriding. It meant a staff officer had done the math, and a captain had signed, and a sergeant had looked his driver in the eye and said, "Don't make me regret trust." Welding a cracked bracket in a barn didn't mean ignoring safety. It meant the weld would be inspected at the next point that had a man who could spell inspector with grease under his nails. Cannibalization is a violent word for a gentle idea. Some trucks were donors, some were recipients. All were honored because all would return to work in one shape or another. A man who gives up his radiator so 3 men won't wait for a week has performed a small, unsung arithmetic of mercy. When the column moves, you see his gift in negative space, the absence of delay spread over a morning. The MPs became a distinct tribe, half traffic engineer and half field philosopher. They had a way of looking down the road that made distance feel like a person who might be persuaded. In a storm, they wore their capes like impatient saints. When a general's staff car arrived hot and offended, the MP would point with the baton and make the concept of rank look suddenly small. It was not insolence. It was faithfulness to a higher order. They knew every corner by temperament. The turn by the bakery was forgiving. The turn by the stand of poplars was jealous. The bridge near the mill had a lip that would throw a truck if you hit it at the wrong song. The MPs talked about songs because cadence kept men alive. "Hold the beat," one of them would say into a driver's face, and what he meant was, "Do not fill this night with your own ideas. Fill it with ours." Enemy artillery discovered that a convoy has moods. If you hit it wrong, it snarls, bunching up, and then a traffic jam becomes a target rich enough to make a gun crew feel useful. We learned to bleed the snarl before it clotted. Rear elements paused, spaces opened, MPs bled the confusion forward like a surgeon nicking a vein. If you hit it right, the convoy ignored you, and you wasted shells on noise that was already past. German after-action notes we later saw talked about harassing fire as if harassment had a score that mattered. Red Ball tracked a different score. Was the dump point on time? Did Third Army's tanks cross the line of departure on schedule? Did the men on a lonely rise get hot chow before midnight? On those measures, harassment resembled weather, a nuisance whose cure was patience and ponchos. Rail versus road is a catechism with more than one correct answer. But in that season, the catechism leaned our way. The rail yards glowed at night with signals that meant opportunity to bombers and interruption to us. Rail is a single throat. Road is a forest of lungs. A bomber group could amputate a yard and call it a day. A fighter could rake a siding and write home feeling useful. But road would simply cough and then inhale. Trucks would detour down lanes that had learned the word logistics for the first time. Priests would look up from the steps of broken churches and see columns sliding past like a river that had found a new bank. Children learned to count in half-ton increments. Wives learned that a convoy has no face, but does have a heart. If this sounds sentimental, ask the infantry what the road meant when their last 2 crates of K-rations went missing, and the next morning a pallet arrived on a bed with a code for their unit stenciled in black and a note made of the driver's laugh. We asked much of the drivers, and then we asked more. Some had never driven anything bigger than a pickup in Missouri, and now they threaded a 6x through a French town designed for ox carts. Some had slept in segregated barracks stateside, and now slept under the same canvas as men who would, in quieter seasons, choose not to see them. Some had mothers who wrote letters that smelled faintly of soap, daughters who sent crayon sons from kitchen tables, fathers who did not write. A few had no letters at all, and drove as if to create correspondence with the future. They tucked photos under sun visors, small smiling reminders of why mile 200 would be worth the tension in their shoulders. They sang sometimes, quietly, and the songs were not always the same as the ones the radio liked back home. They were work songs, a rhythm to steady the feet that in this case were wheels. Patton never worshipped trucks. He worshipped momentum, and trucks were the argument that turned prayer into payment. His staff learned the texture of our schedules the way a chef learns the heat of a stove. Call for a certain volume by a certain hour and accept a different answer for the next day, because weather would choose to be groundskeeper on Wednesday. Except that a bridge a colonel promised yesterday would be ready by noon. Might, by noon, be a story men tell about ambition. Still, the express would arrive, not because ambition had become truth, but because 10,000 small adjustments cured an error that could have been fatal. In the ritual post-war photographs, Patton stands beside tanks and artillery. Somewhere off-frame, a tired man tugs a tarp over a bed of crates and goes to sleep sitting up. If history had perfect framing, the tarp would be in the picture. There was humor, because men are not built to carry only weight. A driver painted a small red dot inside a white circle on his girlfriend's portrait, and when asked why, said, "She's my red ball." An MP named a stubborn intersection Brooklyn because, he said, everybody thinks they own it. Mechanics argued about whether the best prayer for a reluctant starter was gentle, steady, or loud. Each school had champions and claimed miracles. A cook who had been told to stretch coffee beyond reason invented a brew so thin men joked he could see their fortunes at the bottom of the cup. Then he switched to soup, and nobody complained again. Laughter was a kind of lubrication, and without it, the engine would have seized. We took casualties the way a hard factory does, quietly, angrily, substituting new parts while swearing not at fate, but at the small, specific thing that failed. A mine that tried to pretend the road was safe. A corner that turned slick without warning. A driver who closed his eyes for a moment longer than he meant to. The funerals were short, and the eulogies shorter, not because words were cheap, but because time was the only currency the dead would approve us spending wisely. If there is a prayer for truckers, it is surely this: may the road ahead be predictable and the road behind be forgiven. When the route pushed east toward Soissons and Somisou, the maps grew white where the printers had not expected us to go so soon. New drop points improvised themselves into being. A barn became a depot because it had a roof and a yard gate that swung. A field became a park because it had a dry corner. A crossroads became a legend because a stubborn farmer refused to let us cut his hedges, and so an entire brigade learned to swear in French. Men measured days by the towns that gave them 2 minutes of civilian life: a cigarette from a doorway, a nod from a girl carrying bread, the sight of laundry on a line that proved someone had time for patience. We pretended those glimpses were nothing. They were everything, the reminder that logistics feeds life as well as war. By October, the Express had a personality so large you could stand in it like weather. It had moods: brisk in the morning, content at noon, impatient near dusk, reckless at midnight until the midnight shift sergeant walked the line with a voice like a low drum and reminded the boys that trucks are honest only to the honest. It had habits: turning its head toward the west wind when rain smelled like metal, favoring the left side of a lane to miss a rut. The right side never forgot. It had a memory: 1,000 tire tracks layered into a new kind of pavement you could feel even with your eyes closed. When it finally stood down, the silence had weight. Men had to learn to sleep without the road's lullaby, and some discovered that silence was louder than engines when a mind has been trained to vibrate. German reports that survived the war read strangely at this distance. They kept speaking of the American tendency to overdo, as if excess were a character flaw that deserved moral judgment. They were not wrong about our tendency. They were wrong about the judgment. Excess is not always waste. Sometimes it is margin, and margins save you when luck has ideas. Red Ball was margin turned into method. We brought more trucks than the road liked, more fuel than the depots preferred, more tires than the quartermaster's tidy columns approved. We brought them anyway because too much on Monday meant just enough on Thursday when a bridge failed a test. If you squint at the ledger, you can see it smile at prudence and then move on with a shrug, because prudence without delivery is just a theory with good manners. In the cab, a driver learns to talk to his truck the way a sailor talks to his ship. He tells it truths and lies in equal measure. He calls it sweetheart at the top of a grade and tells it was born old when the radiator boils over. He taps the dash when a hill flattens, as if to say thank you, and he slaps the wheel when a bolt refuses to thread. Machinery hears in the only language it knows: maintenance, and Red Ball spoke that language with eloquence. Grease where grease belongs, torque where torque matters, a rag where a rag will keep dust from becoming sand. It is not romance, it is respect, and respect, like fuel, goes further than you think if you stop spilling it. When we look back for heroes, we often reach for the quickest flash. The ace with victory tallies on his tail, the tank commander who wrote his name on a town, the paratrooper photographed in a perfect moment of descent. Red Ball made a different kind of hero, the kind who is hard to photograph. He is squinting through rain at a reflector that should be brighter. She is tightening lug nuts by hand because the pneumatic has lost its temper. He is waving a baton at dawn with a shoulder that forgot what rest is. She is tallying crates by flashlight and cursing softly in arithmetic. If you cannot see them in the clean lines of a monument, close your eyes and listen for trucks, and you will find them. Because work makes a sound memory can keep. A convoy is a promise with many signatures. The driver signs first with his hands. The mechanic signs with wrenches. The MP signs with direction and temper. The depot clerk signs with numbers that will be tested in the field by hungry men. The quartermaster signs with orders that ask the impossible in an entirely reasonable tone. The commander signs by standing in the rain beside a road at least once a week, so his staff cannot forget what their memos require. Each signature is a risk. Stake your name to an outcome in a world that hates outcomes. Red Ball collected signatures and returned receipts. That is all a miracle ever is when you put the shine away. I remember one night outside Soissons when fog came down so fast it felt poured from a bucket. The convoy slowed until each truck could only see the breath of the one ahead. The MP's baton became a ghost. For a wicked minute I thought the road would lose itself, and with it a day's effort. Then a driver 2 trucks up began to call distances softly out his window. 10 yards, 8, 6, and the column took up the chant like monks who had traded robes for oil-stained jackets. We moved at a walk, and the walk was enough. At the dump point, a corporal handed me a cup of coffee strong enough to make the fog blink. He said, "Call it in." I said, "On time?" He nodded like a man hearing a birth announcement. That is what we did. We delivered hours into the hands of people who could use them. When the express wound down in November, some men went back to ordinary trucking that did not feel ordinary anymore. A few went forward into winter fights that would require courage of a different pitch. Many went home eventually and discovered that civilian roads have their own tyrannies, speed limits that feel like jokes, stop signs that feel like betrayals, traffic that refuses to become a column no matter how hard you stare. They kept a piece of the old rhythm in the way they approached a 4-way. Decide, commit, respect the other driver's need to live. Some joined unions and carried batons that looked like MP batons if you were sentimental. Some opened garages where a polite sign asked customers not to watch the work, because watching makes men hurry. In each of them, the road hummed on, a background track you could not entirely mute. Ask a German officer of 1943 what he feared most, and he would likely say weight of metal at a point. Tanks, guns, bombs in exquisite quantities. Ask him in late 1944, after Red Ball had sung for a season, and you might get a different answer said with the dry humor of a professional conceding a point. He feared calendars, not dates on a wall, but the American habit of turning dates into proofs. You said the 10th? Then on the 10th it will be so. And if not, then on the morning of the 11th with such recompense that the delay itself will blush. That is what Red Ball taught at volume. That promises kept are a weapon. The road kept promises in a language even cynics understand. Deliveries, not declarations. There is one more lesson hiding under the grease and dust. Abundance is an ethic. It says we will not send a man into danger with just enough, because just enough is how luck wins. We will send him with more than he needs, so that his mistakes can be corrected and his courage can be saved for the right minute. Red Ball made that ethic visible. It turned warehouses into willpower, timetables into lifelines, strangers into a system. If you stand today on a quiet French road and listen hard, you might hear tires you cannot see and voices you cannot place. That is not nostalgia. That is the aftersound of a promise kept at scale.